Amen. Thank you, congregation. You may be seated. I want to ask you to take your copy of the Scriptures and turn to the book of Hebrews. The book of Hebrews. We're going to be in chapter 10 today, finishing this chapter. If you have been with us through this study, you know that there are warnings spread throughout the book, and this is warning number 4. There is one more after this in chapter 12, really more of an encouragement, but there is a warning that goes with it. Today I want us to ask the question, what do I do about apostasy? What do I do about apostasy? Apostasy we'll define a little bit more as we get later in, but basically it's somebody turning and denying Jesus, denying the faith. Marty Sampson, singer and songwriter for Hillsong. If you listen to Christian music, you've probably heard that name. Hillsong is famous for their quality and amount of music that is usually very good for using in congregational singing for worship services. Somebody that has been with Hillsong, I believe his particular name, better than 15 years, in the last couple of weeks came out and said, I am genuinely losing my faith, and it doesn't bother me. Like, what bothers me now is nothing. I'm so happy now, so at peace with the world, it's crazy. A guy named Joshua Harris, maybe that name rings a bell with you, and maybe it doesn't. He began his writing career early on with a book called I Kissed Dating Goodbye, later stopped dating the church. He's written some others. Bestsellers in the evangelical community, former pastor of a megachurch. He came out just a few weeks ago and said, I have undergone a massive shift in regard to my faith in Jesus. The biblical phrase is falling away. That's exactly the phrase used in Hebrews, by the way. By all the measurements that I have for defining a Christian, I am not a Christian. I don't view this moment negatively. I feel very much alive and awake and surprisingly hopeful. Bart Ehrman, one of the sort of leading authorities and students and scholars on New Testament manuscripts, wrote several books in defense of the New Testament and its authority because we could trace and we could see historically how God had preserved the writings for us to have a reliable copy today. Only later in life decided that he was going to become an open atheist. These and many other leaders of big churches and movements and segments of Christianity, they become well known for something. They rise in influence, and then some of them fall away. They turn against what they once led. Sometimes they say, I'm losing my faith. Sometimes they say, I am not a Christian. Sometimes they just flat out deny that there is a God at all. But you know somebody like this. You know personally somebody who has lived what we might call the Christian life. Went to church, read their Bible, or at least carried it. Might have even been a leader in some regard in a group that you were a part of or in a church that they were a part of, only to find out later in life that they have walked away from that. They have turned against the church, against Christianity, and against Jesus. So what are we to do with these people? What are we to do with this problem of apostasy? Because surely it raises in us a little bit of nervousness, right? I mean, how do you know, based on all these other great leaders, far better than I, that maybe not next week I'm not going to walk in and go, you know what, I decided there's no Jesus, I'm not a Christian anymore. was just kidding. It was hypothetical. Ain't happening. Is that me? We good? Okay. How do you buy into and follow somebody's leadership if maybe you've been a part of somebody's leadership before who then turned away from Christ? Surely it causes you to look at your own life and go, oh my goodness, am I following some false religion? Am I following some false gospel? Or at best, it makes it difficult for you then later to invest and follow some other leader, maybe thinking, oh, maybe they're going to turn away too. How do I really know? Maybe you look at your friends in the pew and you go, you know what, I had people that sat down the pew for me for 10 years and then they just walked away from Jesus. How do I know these people down the pew aren't going to do the same thing? In Hebrews chapter 10, we looked at last week, there are 4 calls of how God's child should respond to the truths in Hebrews 1 through 9. In Hebrews 1 through 9, the writer is going through and systematically comparing Jesus to everything from the old life of the first century Jew. He's saying, let's compare it to angels, let's compare him to the prophets, let's compare him to Moses. How about Abraham? How about Aaron? How about the whole Levite priesthood? How about the Old Testament sacrifices? How about the tabernacle? He goes through and he compares Jesus to everything that they would have held dear and followed after. And he always comes to the conclusion, Jesus is better than that. And he gets to Hebrews chapter 10. And he says in verse 19, therefore, brethren, based on these things, and he calls them to 4 biblical, practical responses. He says, number 1, draw near to God in authentic worship. Ritualism and superstition will do you no good. You might as well stay home on Sunday morning, do breakfast in bed, rub a rabbit's foot, say abracadabra, and be done with it. You don't need to bother getting up, getting dressed, coming to church. If this is just some ritual you go through, waiting to see if maybe God drops in and does something. That's just superstition. That's ritual. That will do you no good. We are to draw near to Him in authentic worship. It's in the passage where he walks through the 3 parts of that. Secondly, he says, hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering. He says we have to make sure that we're not giving up just because something got hard or something brought some pressure in on us. Third, he says we must consider one another, and that's not just a mental thought that's fleeting and passing like a good intention that never manifests. That is, we are to look into the real person in each other's lives. I am to know you and your life. You're to know me and my life. Why? So that we can stir each other up to love and to good deeds. It is the same theme that runs throughout the New Testament of the interdependent, authentic relationships that God calls for between Christians. And then the last one, he says specifically, to not forsake the assembling of ourselves together. And he gives a quantification in that, lest we think that's philosophical or some theoretical thing. At the end of the verse, he says, and so much the more. Those are 2 different words. One means so much. It's whatever you measure your faithfulness to the gathering of the church as now, so much, whatever that is, the more. If it's 1 or 2, then it needs to be 3 or 4. If it's half, then it needs to be a whole. If it's whatever, so much, whatever it's measured at right now, it needs to be more. And so much the more, as you see the day approaching, he ties it back in again to the anticipation of the coming of Jesus, of the culmination of all of these things, that this is not a ritual, this is not superstition. We are doing what we're doing. Jesus is coming, and we're just looking and waiting until that moment because we don't know when it is yet. And he says those are the 4 things that we ought to especially respond to these truths with. And then comes verse 26. For if we sin willfully after we have received the knowledge of the truth, there no longer remains a sacrifice for sins, but a certain fearful expectation of judgment and fiery indignation which will devour the adversaries. That's pretty strong, isn't it? It's pretty harsh, isn't it? Now, I want to clear one thing up in here because we read it and we might forget good biblical interpretation. We always read a passage understanding what was God saying to the original audience. That has to be the foundation that we come out of as we interpret Scripture. And so we remember that he's writing to first century believers who would have been a faithful part of tabernacle worship and now have trusted in the offering and the blood and the sacrifice of Jesus. And so when he says to them, those of you who were in that, but have turned away from it and by faith trusted in Jesus and his sacrifice, if you are now to turn away from Jesus and to go to something else, he says there is no sacrifice left. What does he mean? He says, you've already recognized that the sacrifices of the Old Testament don't do it. You already know that doesn't work. And you went to Jesus, and now if you turn away from the sacrifice of Jesus, there is no sacrifice left to go to. He's not saying Christ's blood doesn't count anymore. He's saying you have nowhere to go. You've already denied that, now you're denying this. It's like being caught between first and second base as a baseball player. There is no safe place. You can't just stop in the middle and go, well, I'll just hang out here. Well, you're out. So that's not saying that God doesn't allow people who sin to have access to forgiveness. That's not what it's saying. He's making a statement straight to these first century believers of where are you going to go? You can't go back to the temple. You know that's false. If you're not going to follow Jesus, you got nothing. So by application, understanding that in our lives, if you've turned against your old life because you realize it wasn't making any difference, it wasn't changing you, you couldn't deal with your own sin, and now you're going to turn away from Jesus and go, I'm not going to trust Jesus to deal with my sin, you got nowhere to go. So as we look at this, I want us to notice a couple of things, and I want us to answer this question of what are we to do about apostasy. First, notice in the passage that there is a correlation between learning and sin. There's a direct tie between learning the truth of God's Word and choosing to continue in sin in your life. Now, how many of you had the experience where at some point in your Christian journey, somebody read a verse, taught you something, explained something, and you realized, oh my goodness, I've been sinning and didn't even know it? Oh, wow. Okay, just the five of us. All right. So yeah, that happens. Why? Because we don't get saved and immediately know all of the Bible. There's stuff that we learn and go, oh, wow, that's wrong. I didn't know that. I'll stop that now. Thank you. Well, but if we were to learn that information and go, oh, that's wrong, well, I'll keep doing it. Thank you. Well, how does that add up? You see, once we know the truth, we have a responsibility to do something with it. And from that point that we learn the truth on, we are either choosing to allow sin to stay in our lives. We know it's sin, we know it's there, and we like it, and so we keep it. Or we make application of the truth and we begin to turn away from that sin and get that sin out of our lives. It's one or the other. We see all through chapters 1 through 9, he writes truth and truth and truth, and he gets to the verses in 19 through 25 in chapter 10, and he says, look, you need to do this, and you need to do this, and you need to have relationships with other people and come together with your church family, for if we sin willfully after we've received the knowledge of the truth, what's he saying? He's saying, now you know, and you know very well, and if you now, knowing the truth, don't apply it in these do something with it ways, you will be sinning willfully. You'll be going forward knowing that what you're doing is sin, you're not addressing it, you're choosing to stay in your sin. 2 Peter chapter 2 and verse 21 says this, for it would have been better for them not to have known the way of righteousness than having known it to turn from the holy commandment delivered to them. These people have received a whole treasure chest of truth, and the writer now says, now if you don't do something with it, you're walking forward willfully choosing to sin. James chapter 4 verse 17, it says it this way, therefore to him who knows to do good and doesn't do it, it is sin. You see, if we don't make application of the truth that we learn, then we are choosing to keep sin. It's like driving down 30, and you're in the left-hand lane, and there's traffic in the right-hand lane, and you see down the way there's these pretty orange barrels decorating the side of the road, and they make a line across your lane, and there's a big flashing arrow, and in strobe lights, it makes this arrow pointing you to the right, and you go, wow, those are pretty lights, and you stay in your lane, you make a wreck of yourself. You bring destruction and damage and injury. What should you do? Now that you know the truth, you should make application and get over. Merge, not just, immediately go over. You got to look at the other cars. But when you're driving down in life and God lays the truth out in front of you and says, this is going to cause you a wreck, and you don't make application, we can't be surprised when things turn out a wreck. Now, this first century Jewish person that the writer is talking to has received already the warnings of chapter 2. He says, be careful that you don't drift gradually through neglecting your salvation. If you neglect your salvation and you don't pay attention to it and work on manifesting in it and growing in your faith, I think it's 1 Peter says, add to your faith virtue, and to virtue knowledge, and to knowledge temperance, and he goes through a whole list of what we ought to focus on growing and developing. And he says if you neglect that salvation, you're going to drift off into error and sin. In chapter 3, it warns of being worn down through trials and hard times to the point where we have a hardened heart toward God. We blame Him for the difficulties in life, and we have a hardened heart, and it is not after Him. Chapter 6 warns of falling away. That means choosing to go away, because God will let you go and will choose to leave you to your own consequences and your own makings. And now in chapter 10, the warning is against deliberately choosing a lifestyle of sin, presuming upon the forgiveness of God. Now, this is a difficult passage. I'll be honest with you. I struggled all week on, that this is not just regular old apostasy, that we have to be faithful to the text. This is a warning for apostasy, and I want to unpack it for us. So if you're taking notes, this is 2, the warning for apostasy, and under that we've got a couple of things we need to look at. First, this is a practical apostasy. This is a practical apostasy that the writer is talking about. What do I mean by that? All throughout this text, chapter 10, verse 26, all the way through the end of the chapter, he is dealing with people who behave in a certain way. Now, I'm not talking about one individual sin, but he's dealing with the behavior in the life of a person, not a theological perspective, not a doctrinal perspective. This is not a person whose behavior never changes, and they go from going, yes, I believe in Jesus, to the next day they say, no, I don't believe in Jesus. We're not talking about a theoretical or a verbal apostasy. We're talking about somebody whose life manifests apostasy. Here he is addressing apostasy by behavior rather than a philosophical position. We got to figure out what's going on with that. Look in verse 26. He says, if we sin willfully. He doesn't say if we come out with a treatise on our doctrinal position. He doesn't say if we teach thus. He says if we sin. And that word there is a continual activity. He says if we are sinning, it's a choice. He says, if we sin after we've received the knowledge of the truth. In other words, there is a procedure here. The truth came into your life. After that, you made some decisions to behave a certain way. And his immediate argument against it is there's no longer a sacrifice for it. That means they had the necessary information to choose differently, and they didn't. This is based on their choice of how to behave. You see, the Hebrews were very familiar with the idea of choosing a behavior and later finding out that they did it in ignorance. In Leviticus chapter 5 and verse 18, there was even a sacrifice for it. It says, and he shall bring to the priest a ram without blemish from the flock, with your valuation as a trespass offering. So the priest shall make atonement for him regarding his ignorance in which he erred and did not know it, and it shall be forgiven him. There was a whole sacrifice for when you learn you've been sinning and you didn't even know it. God says, that happens. Here's the sacrifice. It's called a trespass. You crossed the line. It's not okay, but it was done in ignorance. So take this sacrifice, go make that sacrifice. That'll atone for your sin. This, in chapter 10, is not ignorance. It is not a singular failure. It's not struggling against a temptation that you are weak toward. It's a practical apostasy, but the second thing we see is that it is a perpetual apostasy. This is not a one-time event. This is not a pre-salvation condition. This is not even a pre-discipleship period of time. When it says in verse 26, for if we sin, we would think, by the way that we speak and the way that we write in our grammar, we would think that sin is the main issue here. But sin is what's called a participle. It rides on the coattails of something else. What is it riding on the coattails of? The verse says, for if we sin willfully after we have received the knowledge of the truth. The main thing here, the verb is have received. You've had the truth delivered to you, and coming along as a part of that is that you have then chosen to be in a perpetual state of sin. And not by accident, willfully. You've thought through this. You've made a decision to go into it, knowing full well that it's wrong, calculated as best you can the consequences. By the way, there are consequences we can calculate in sin. I know how much certain sins are going to cost me. But there's always cost to sin that you can't calculate. There's always consequences to sin that I can't foresee, that I can't adjust for, that I can't decide on. We watch our kids do this, don't we? At some age, they get to the point where you've been telling them no, and they just no because mom and dad say no. And then you see them at that age where you go no, and they go, yeah, I'm going to do it anyway. They've calculated the consequences. They've decided the sin is worth it. But folks, we can never calculate all of the consequences of sin. We just can't do it. But this person, as best they can, have sat and considered it. They've chosen it. They've processed in their mind and said, I will go into it anyway. And this word sin it's in a present continual state. This is not you struggled with it for a while. This is not you are wrestling against the temptation that is overtaking you. This is not you've been tripping